All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some of you joining us from afar. We are so happy you're joining us today for this very, very special session on what is solutions journalism that complicates the narratives. Some of you might be like, I don't know what either of those mean. Some of you might be like, I know what both of those mean. And before we get started, we're actually going to launch a quick poll to see who here has been trained in solutions journalism, complicating the narratives, both or neither. And as we're taking that poll, I am so honored to introduce the two amazing co-hosts of this call. You wouldn't be here in this room talking about this thing called complicating the narratives without them. So first up, we have my wonderful former colleague, Hélène Bianduti-Hofer. Hélène is here. She's a journalist and documentary filmmaker. For nearly a decade, she led an award-winning news magazine program focused on exploring remedies to societal challenges, aka solutions journalism. Most recently, Hélène developed and managed the Solution Journalism Network's Complicating the Narratives project, which she's going to talk a little bit about today. In short, CTN is a journalistic practice that can transform news coverage about controversial issues. She's trained more than 1,000 journalists across 125 newsrooms around the world. She's worked with CBS, NPR, PBS, and she credits her passion for journalism to her Nikoko. Did I say that correctly?
Nikoko, good job.
Her beautiful great grandmother, who was the oral historian of the Bianduti family. Thanks, Hélène.
Thank you, Jules. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here.
And the other lovely journalist we have on this call is the wonderful Amanda Ripley. As we write in the post, Amanda wrote that essay, Complicating the Narratives, almost 4 years ago. It's been the most widely shared thing that's ever come out of our blog. We're going to hear a little bit more about why that might be and ask you why you think that might be today. But to learn a little bit more about Amanda, she is a New York Times bestselling author and investigative journalist. Her projects combine storytelling with data to help illuminate hard problems and solutions. Her books include High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. I'm lucky to have a signed copy right here. The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way, and The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why. She spent a decade writing about human behavior for Time magazine, helped Time win 2 national magazine awards, and she's reported from all over the world, from Colombia, South Korea, Finland, Poland, the United Kingdom, many, many more. She currently lives in Washington, D.C. So good morning, Amanda.
Good morning, Jules. So good to see you.
All righty. So that's a bit about who they are. And the last thing I'll say about these two folks is they've both worked with SJN, training and writing and designing this great curriculum. And now they've launched a project called Good Conflict that helps communities and companies get smarter about how they fight by incorporating insights from neuroscience, conflict mediation, social psychology, and solutions journalism. They make it easier for people to respond to discord without collapsing into contempt. So that's who's on the call today. We're looking forward to learning more about you all. But for now, I am going to turn it on over to Amanda and Hélène to get us started on what is solutions journalism that complicates the narrative.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jules. Amanda, sorry, I've been talking. Do you want to say anything before
I'm very excited to be here. Very grateful to Solutions Journalism for having us back and for making all this possible. I can't believe it's been that long, but it feels like just yesterday that I ran into David Bornstein and he was like, why don't you go off and write about what journalists could learn from conflict mediators? And I was like, I'm pretty sure it's nothing, but okay. So anyway, I was wrong and here we are. Good to be with everyone.
All right, so I'm going to share the poll results. So I don't know if everyone can see them. So, and Amanda, this is important for us to know. So 0% of the people who responded to the poll have been trained in complicating the narratives, 54% solutions journalism they've been trained in, 25% both, and 21% neither. So this is good to know, just
Right.
it gives us a taste of the audience. So
there's no right answer here, by the way.
So this will be a refresh for some, brand new for others. And we're just super excited to be a part of this session. And the plan is, our goal is for you to walk away and for you to have answers to some of those questions that you were thinking about when you read the post that Jules wrote about the CTN fellowship. So this is really for you. We want you to be armed and ready to, fill out that application, think about those projects, have ideas, kind of circulating when we wrap today. So because this is for you, drop questions in the chat, jump off mute along the way so that we can answer them. And we'll get Jules mixed in, and there's some other friends from CTN on this call too, and they can help us out. All right, so I am going to share this with you. And this is the question that you saw on the application in Jules' post for the CTN fellowship. What are the great solution stories to be done in times of conflict? So our ask is for you to just ponder this question over the next 20 to 30 minutes, and we'll spend some time brainstorming in a bit. So if you feel stuck and you're not sure, what you could pitch as a project, hopefully you'll leave with some of those questions answered and a couple ideas in mind. All right, so as we mentioned, this is going to be a refresh, and a refresh is good. So let's talk a little bit about these two practices. And the first is, and many of you are very familiar with solutions journalism and why we do it. So we're talking about rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. And solution stories are compelling. I will never forget when I heard CTN co-founder Tina Rosenberg say, solutions journalism is hope with teeth. And I love that. And that deeply resonated with me. These are not fluff stories. These are investigative pieces that drill down and help people make sense of things. They ask that question, who is doing it better? And why do we do solutions journalism? Well, solution stories, they provide valuable insights. They help people serve these wide issues that we're dealing with throughout the world. And research that has been done on solutions journalism has found that these types of stories, they can change the tone of public discourse, making it less divisive and more constructive. And then there's complicating the narratives. And this is a journalistic practice that draws from the experience of experts in conflict and also psychology. Why do we do it? CTN techniques, they require that we really do slow down our entire process to how we do reporting. And that might sound incredibly scary at first, but we later realize when we use these techniques, they're invaluable. Complicating the narratives helps us tell nuanced stories when we report on conflict and division. Stories that hopefully make sense of things happening in this world, in our community, stories that really illuminate. And this is how we do it. So we complicate the narrative through these 4 pillars: listen differently, go beneath the problem, embrace complexity, and counter confirmation bias. Now, we have a link to Amanda's piece, Complicating the Narratives, that we'll drop in the chat. And these 4 pillars, and many of you have likely read it, and you'll find these 4 pillars are informed by Amanda's 6 key findings in that piece. So definitely be sure to read that if you haven't done so yet. All right, so here is the plan. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, we are going to walk you through each pillar, and we'll talk about the specific CTN techniques affiliated with each pillar. The techniques are essential for you to know because that is what you'll be using. You'll be using those techniques and strategies for the solution stories that you'll produce during the fellowship. All right. And rather than us talking at you for 10 to 15 minutes, we thought it might be beneficial for you to hear from some journalists using these techniques in their work. All right, so we're going to kick off with pillar 1, listen differently. And Amanda, before we introduce Smriti Jacob from the Rochester Beacon, do you want to talk about what you found in terms of your research on listening and just how essential it really is in terms of doing stories on deep division?
Sure. Yeah. So probably the most transformative skill that I think it's fair to say both Alen and I have learned in trying to understand conflict is this way of listening differently in ways that sources can see. So I used to think listening was like nodding and smiling, and that was good. And people can tell the difference when you're really listening. So Smrti does a great job explaining not only what it is, but also the initial skepticism that I think most journalists, including myself and Alen, had going into this kind of training. But I will say I use it every day. I use it with my kid. I use it with my husband. I use it with my Uber drivers. I use it with random people yelling on the street, and I use it in every interview. So I can't oversell it. So let's let Smrti do the rest.
Yeah.
When I got trained, I thought looping was ridiculous. I thought, oh my goodness, I have to go suffer through this to get at some answer that I would have found out anyway. After the second training, I realized it was not as difficult. I realized that the person I was looping with for a looping exercise, opened my eyes that I had not heard properly. I had not listened well enough. And so it became like a challenge. I wanted to be a better listener. I wanted to ask better questions. And I found that I was using my own understanding to figure out the answer. And that was like an eye opener for me. So looping is, while it has sort of there's a way to do it, it is so different what you get. Yes, you may seem to think it's so formulaic, but it's not. And that's what changed for me, is that it really depends on the story. I'm sure this is basic and 101, but that was my experience, that it opened my eyes. It opened my eyes to myself, really, and how I sort of the errors in my ways in terms of questioning. I felt a little embarrassed that I may not have heard it right. But do you know what? The sources appreciate that. They appreciate that check-in. They appreciate your reflection. It builds that trust.
So in a nutshell, when you loop, your focus is on listening intently to your source to understand what's most important to them. And then you reflect back on what you understood and you ask them if you got it right. And you can learn more about looping in the CTN Learning Lab Toolkit, and we'll drop a link to that toolkit in the chat. I highly suggest bookmarking it. I have it bookmarked. I love to go back and kind of revisit some of these concepts. But any questions before we move on to pillar 2? Okay. All right, we will go ahead and jump into pillar 2, which is all about going beneath the problem. And when we say going beneath the problem, that's essentially about getting under the conflict. So in this pillar, you're trying to uncover a person's motivations and their interests, their beliefs, what drives them, their values, and not just focus on their position. And excavating that type of information, when you're able to do it, it helps you to present a much more accurate picture of your source, the person that you're interviewing. And usually that picture shows a very complicated, complex person, because that's what we all are. And so what we do to get underneath the problem is we ask different types of questions, specifically the 22 interview questions to complicate the narrative. And what we'll do is we'll listen to Jessica Bain from the Arizona Republic, and she'll describe how using those questions has really been transformative for her and her reporting.
After I really spent some time studying those questions and thinking about the importance of going beyond just the conflict that's in the story and really understanding why someone feels that way, it's really helped me to provide more nuance to my coverage. We all have sources that throughout time have become distrustful of the media for whatever reason. Maybe they've felt ignored. Maybe they have felt like they've not been portrayed correctly. The people who already have a preconceived notion of how the interview is going to go are the ones that are most impressed to feel listened to at the end of the day. And that's really what these deeper questions do. They allow you to get beyond the, I don't like X and I don't like Y type of reporting and really understand someone. Some of the work that I do includes spending a lot of time with individuals, profiling them, profiling people experiencing homelessness, especially, which is a really difficult situation for someone to be in, obviously. And I have found that a lot of people experiencing homelessness may have had contact with the media before, and it's been very superficial. And I think what's been great for me is that by just spending time with these folks and asking harder questions and challenging them on their own beliefs, that kind of deeper level conversation with someone really allows you to see the nuance that makes a person a person. I look back at some of the stories I did before Complicating the Narratives, and I really think about the opinions and the nuance that I missed in those stories. It has really helped me to just tell more nuanced stories that I think are actually helping my community make better decisions, which is at the end of the day what we want to do in journalism.
If you're wondering about those questions, those are also in that link to the Learning Lab Toolkit. And Amanda, am I right? Don't you have the questions like right at your desk space so you can always refer to them for interviews?
Yeah, I have them there. And the one that is like my go-to when someone says something like really shocking and I don't know what to say, and like every part of my body just wants to end the interview, I say one of the ones on there, which is, tell me more. So it's sometimes you can't think, right? So you have to just look at the list.
Yeah,
At least for
it's
me.
so helpful. It's so helpful. I like what's oversimplified about this issue. That's one I always like, because I feel like you're able to navigate things that you weren't expecting with that one. Before we move on to pillar 3, any questions about this one, about going beneath the problem and the technique of asking different questions? All right, we will move right along. So the third pillar is embracing complexity in the interviews and the stories that we produce. And when we embrace complexity, Jessica mentioned this just a little bit in the video, we kind of avoid that default sometimes. And I know that I did this in reporting, and I would say, well, here's what side A says about this matter. Here's what side B says about this matter. And I find some stats and mix it in, and I feel like, voila, that's like this great recipe for a story. And that's kind of the old way that I used to do it. And now with embracing complexity, yes, the facts are essential, but we're also examining complex sides. And we do that to really provide context. And there are a few different ways that we can go about embracing complexity. And one thing is to just be very clearly in our reporting, acknowledge it to the audience and say, this is not a black and white issue. This is much more complicated than we may think. And to add that level of transparency into the reporting that we do. Another way, and Amanda talks a lot about this in the Complicating the Narratives piece, is widening the lens. So Amanda, do you want to explain what that involves before we hear from John?
Sure. And just to kind of give a little backstory on this. So we know that some things are not complicated, right? What we found and what researchers have found is that in times of intense conflict, like we are in a very polarized country, a lot of things get oversimplified and there's a lack of curiosity, right? Things feel very predictable. People tune out. Lots of things happen that are very normal for how humans behave in intense conflict. And that the good news is you can prime people for complexity and curiosity by doing journalism a little differently. So one thing we know for sure is that traditional journalism just doesn't work the way we want it to in times of high conflict. So this is a way to try to provoke some curiosity and interest where there was none in a subject that's gotten really divisive or tired. And what we found is there are all kinds of different ways to do this, but Alen mentioned widen the lens, which is one of my favorite, and I think probably the easiest way to do this when you're under deadline, which is, so in high conflict, we literally lose our peripheral vision, and figuratively. So we miss things, we make mistakes, we lose curiosity. And it turns out that there's a way to come at it sideways and revive all those things. So, and there's a ton of research on this, but just to summarize, there are two ways to widen the lens on a conflict that I think are easiest to do, and it's basically through time and space. So you want to either go back into history and look at a similar conflict in your town and see what happened there. I apologize. And then you want to, or look at the same conflict in a different country, right? So those are ways to revive curiosity where there was none, by looking at it a little bit from a distance. And so I guess I'll let John take it from there.
Yeah, sounds good. So this is John Deanna. He's formerly from the Arizona Republic, and he's now working with the Santa Rosa Press Democrat.
A lot of the kinds of stories I do are not black and white. They're not just real cut and dried in and out kinds of things. And they require you to think a lot and maybe look for the things that people aren't saying as much as the things they are saying. I just kept hearing this narrative of divided country, will we ever get back? Will we ever get back? And I have to admit that I'm a little partial to that Yeats poem, The Second Coming. And so that line, the center cannot hold, just has always made me wonder, can the center ever hold? I happen to be driving in a neighborhood that's 5 or 6 miles from where I live, and I saw a Biden sign from the street corner, and I thought, man, that's kind of weird in that neighborhood. And so I turned around, drove down that street, and sure enough, there was a house with a Trump sign. And so I thought, okay, maybe the house in the middle would be that center house. But the guy with the Biden sign was okay talking, and the guy with the Trump sign was okay talking. So I started knocking on other doors in the neighborhood. And then I went across the street, and there was the guy who just was the guy in the middle, the center, kind of the metaphor for the story. It was a fun experience to use a lot of the techniques. I found that context is really a journalist's best friend. And if you can explore that context and get a fuller understanding of it for yourself, and then find a way to convey that to readers, that's just going to improve your journalism and improve your story. We focus so much as journalists on the who, what, when, and where, but so often it's that why that makes your story so much richer and so much more meaningful. Conflict tends to alienate people, but our lives are not free from it. But sometimes that conflict leads to tension, and tension is, I think, that does engage people. I mean, the tension in a suspense movie, it keeps you going. And so I think if you can explore that tension, you have a better chance at engaging readers as opposed to, just writing both sides of the conflict, and that just pushes people apart.
All right. So any questions about pillar 3 and embracing complexity before we move on to our last pillar? All right. Well, with that, we are at pillar 4, and this is the final one. This is about countering confirmation bias. And this can feel really tricky. And confirmation bias is when we lean on evidence and information that we already believe. It supports our existing views. And then that we tend to ignore what doesn't. And through, with complicating the narratives, this idea is that if you don't want your listeners, your viewers, your readers to just, dismiss your coverage and the projects that you're working on and these engagement efforts that you're really trying to build in your community, just because it doesn't fit with their pre-existing views, let's figure out a way through our reporting, through the ways in which we strategically gather people together to try to counter confirmation bias. And there are different techniques and different ways to go about doing this. And one, and Amanda, I'm going to ask if you'll talk a little bit about this, is data visualizations and using data to help.
Right. So it is tricky, as we all know, to counter confirmation bias. People do not want to hear, and they will just justify or ignore information that contradicts their pre-existing narratives, especially in high conflict, right? So this is a hard one, but a really important one. Some of the most surprising research that we found was research that showed that people are more open to hearing information they don't want to hear when it is conveyed to them graphically. So data visualization seems to be one way to kind of get over that barrier with real, important, useful information to people that might not fit in their pre-existing narratives. So this is one that, again, is maybe a low-hanging fruit that that can help news organizations convey information that isn't getting through in other ways. And the question is why? Why are more people more willing to believe information that's in a chart or a graphic than me telling them, right? And there are different theories, but I think my best guess is that it comes down to what's known as the Betty Crocker theory. I don't know if anyone knows about this, but basically, when people feel like they are coming up with something themselves, or they have some input, they're more likely to believe it, especially in times of low trust. But the Betty Crocker piece is that decades ago, Betty Crocker was able to create a cake mix that you could buy in a box, and you literally just add water, boom, you got a cake. And they thought that was just fantastic. But it turned out that actual humans wanted to be able to do a little bit of their own contribution to the cake with an egg or milk or whatever it is. So they changed the formula. So you'd have to add an egg and milk. So you felt like you were part of it. And I think with a data visualization, there's a little bit of that, right? You can kind of come to your own conclusion, or at least more so than if someone's just telling you what to think.
And then another way is to counter confirmation bias is through engagement and engagement events, and really thinking strategically about how can we bring people together to, maybe there's an issue that we're covering in our newsroom, to talk about it, to create opportunities for people to listen, to learn to the different stories, different, observations or experiences that people might have. And maybe when we do that, we can start to chart out possible options for a path forward in our community. So we're going to hear from Ku'u Kanoin. She's from the Honolulu Civil Beat, and she has done a number of different engagement events and kind of really thinking about complicating the narratives in this pillar 4 in terms of how to do it. So we'll hear from her right now.
I think a lot of times when we think about journalism, it's very much like reporting about the community. And when I think about storytelling, I really think about what are the stories that are not just about the community, but for them, right? So I think with Pillar 4 and countering confirmation bias, it's really about bringing people together and sharing a space with people so that everyone feels heard, and also creating stories that feel most representative for the community. When I think about my reporting and when I think about confirmation bias, I always come with a level of respect and also curiosity. When we started our West Side Engagement Project, we did it with little listening circles. So about 5 people. I tried to pick people who I knew were really involved in their community, but didn't usually talk to the news. And I wanted to make sure that they felt comfortable talking to me and creating that trust. I think trust is key when we're talking with the community, because I want them to know that I care, and I want them to know that the stories that we write aren't just about them, but for them, you know? One of our circles that we did, we were talking about infrastructure. It was amazing to see that both of these people, it was 2 people, they came from kind of like 2 opposite sides of what the issues are with infrastructure. And for them to be able to have this space to just talk it out with each other, I don't think there was an instance where they have heard from the other side before, you know? So having this space where they could hear and also like try to understand and open their eyes to like the other side. I mean, at the end of it, they were both like, I respect you for sharing that, or respect you for saying that, or I see what you're saying. And that's gratifying for me to be able to sit in on that experience, to see that like, wow, these people came in with such opposing opinions, but together they really opened each other up. That's the thing about complicating the narratives, right? It's not just one narrative, it's a bunch of them. How do we create a space where people can share and feel like they're respected and heard is just the most gratifying thing for me, to see people really learn.
Okay, so any questions at all about Pillar 4 and the techniques affiliated with countering confirmation bias? Okay, we have a quiet group so far, but we're about to kick it up just a little notch. And here's the thing, this fellowship, if you think about it, it's a really cool experiment, because we're taking CTN techniques, everything that you just heard about. Some of you are probably already using these techniques in your reporting, applying them to solution stories and engagement events, and then just like, what happens, right? How do people respond? What's the impact? What are the possibilities? And that's the great thing. And I love that the Solutions Journalism Network is doing this, to say like, this is an experiment. Let's see what we can come up with. So what we're going to do is stop sharing the screen so we can see everyone. I can finally see faces. And we'll talk about that question that we posed early on, the one that we asked you to ponder for just a bit. You know, what are the great solution stories to be done in times of intense conflict? And so let me stop sharing. Okay, great. I can see now. All right. So we're just going to spend a few minutes. We'll spend about 5 minutes. Open it up. You can, yes, Jules, thank you. You can use the raise hand function. How are you thinking about this right now, and what's coming to mind for you?
Yes, Demetria, feel free to come off mute and let us know what you're thinking.
Awesome. Hi, thank you for that great introduction and sort of summary of the techniques. So I'm thinking, I'm an educator, but I also went to school for journalism, and my great goal in life is to sort of try to figure out how to merge them together. Over the course of being a parent, and then during the pandemic, I've started looking at more alternative forms of education. I homeschool my son, and I'm working on creating an ecosystem here in Nevada that provides micro-schooling options in tandem with the district schools and charter schools. So long story short, I'm looking at figuring out how we can talk about education in a way that is not divisive. And that provides as many options for parents and families and children as possible.
I think that's fantastic. I think that is so absolutely needed. We need you here in Rochester. I think we need you in every city in this country. And I love that you're thinking about, you know, these skills that you went to school for journalism, you are an educator. How do we kind of mold these two things together? And then you know the needs because you have this lived experience as a mom, you know, kind of searching through and sifting through a lot of these problems and issues that you're dealing with. To create opportunities for people to talk and learn and listen to each other and do things in a different way.
Beautiful. Yes. Thank you, Demetria. And I see,
cool.
Just to shout out Amanda here. Amanda also wrote a book about education and then writes in her next book, High Conflict, about the sort of reactions that writing has got and how it is an area that often, especially in the United States, is very divisive. So we welcome that. We love that vision.
Yeah, I think I can't
yeah.
think of a better beat for this particular, I mean, there's lots of choices, unfortunately, but for this particular fellowship, education right now, actually, education had a lot of high conflict before it was a trend. So it's a really rich area. And I think it's great that you're thinking about how to do this differently. And I would cover education differently now, knowing what I know about how people behave in conflict. So that's a great place to be.
Awesome. Let's hear from Sandra Larson. Love to hear what you're thinking.
Hi there. Hi, Jules. My idea that came into my mind was also about education, probably very similar, or definitely with some overlap, but more specifically, public versus charter schools. Here in Boston, it feels like that's just a very polarizing issue. And if you even, in some cases, if somebody even mentions that, well, maybe charter schools are better for some people, that's like they must be anti-public education and they're with the corporate interests, and there just doesn't seem to be any room for a middle ground. And that seems very divisive, especially because the kids are not benefiting from that kind of inability to talk across. And then also we also have had a big controversy about admissions to the exam schools here. And I know that's been a big issue in San Francisco too. You probably know that they tried to just go throughout the exam and do it all by lottery, and I think that got overturned. But anyone who thinks that there needs to be any sort of exam in the process is labeled as a racist, and it's, again, just impossible to talk with any nuance about it. So those are two ideas that have come to mind for me locally anyway.
Sandra, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think when I said I would do my own coverage differently, I think that is the piece that I think I kind of, even if it wasn't always conscious, or I didn't overtly do it, it was in my head that there were like two camps, right? And anytime, charter versus traditional, right? Reformers versus traditional, teachers union versus reformers, right? And that's kind of like how you go into the story already. And what we know from the research is that anytime you divide humans into categories like that, particularly where there's any sense of hierarchy, they will behave badly in conflict and make a lot of mistakes and miss like a huge number of opportunities. And if I could go back, maybe one story I would do is, the reason charter schools, when they were started, the argument was, oh, this will be a lab for experimenting and then all the schools can learn. Well, why hasn't that happened, right? Because it's us versus them. And are there ways to, and we definitely, I think it's fair to say, Ellen, have very specific ideas about ways that you could complicate that narrative, but also break the binary with your source selection and framing. So I think that's another great area for further inquiry.
It's great.
Sure.
Yes.
And Sandra, just so you see, Demetria dropped a message in the chat. So already connections being made so that you two can connect and talk further.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for both of you for sharing. And if any other ideas, come to mind that you'd like to share at this stage, please feel free to flood the chat. What we're going to do now is I'm going to share my screen again, and we are going to take a look at just a couple examples. We've got two here for you of solution stories that incorporate CTN techniques. All right, so the first one that we are going to look at, and we've got links too, so we'll drop links in the chat for you for each of these stories. And the first one comes from Are We Europe? And this is from their 11th issue titled The Queer Issue. And this piece in particular is about navigating the intersection of sexual orientation and ethnicity in Romania. And Romania is an incredibly conservative country, considered to be the most religious in Europe. So when thinking about CTN techniques, the journalist shared multiple diverse life experiences of individuals in Romania who are queer and Roma, so that you understood that no one person represents an entire group, nor do their experiences. They are very different and very unique, and you learn about that through those stories. What I also really loved and appreciated was the historical context. Amanda talked about widening the lens, so space and time. And it was really great to go back in time to get this explainer to kind of get a sense of why are things so politically charged with this particular group and what's happening and how did it get to this point and where's the misunderstanding. And there's also an expert who talks a lot about what people likely don't know about intersectionality. So we learn also in this piece that each individual profile does play a significant role when it comes to advocating and supporting queer people from disadvantaged backgrounds. The work that's taking place so that there are safe spaces for them to meet and to share and to better understand and accept themselves. So it was a really interesting way to see the different solutions that the reporter was able to uncover and mix in some of those CTN techniques with the piece. And then we've got one more here. And this is from Emily Casriel of the BBC's Crossing Divides. And this example is real. I love this because it's a news organization. You got the BBC, they collaborated with the British Council to launch this deep listening project in Lebanon. And the goal was to teach participants deep listening, looping, you heard about looping, so that in the hopes that it would really help them kind of harness empathy, really suspend judgment, learn about others. And what we get in this article, we hear from two individuals 1 year after participating in that listening project. And we hear about how they were challenged, how their biases and assumptions were challenged, how they learned to better understand people rather than seeing them as the enemy. And the reader discovers in this piece that, even though these two individuals, we hear about this process of learning and growth that took place, they also are still holding on to biases and assumptions and what they're still working through. So it was nice to kind of see the learning component, but also understand, what they're still wrestling with, in this moment. So another great example, and we've got the link for this one for you as well. And we've got good news for you. When you read those stories, we'll likely have some questions and you'll get to hear from the news organizations from each of those stories next week. So next Thursday, and we've got a link so you can register. There's going to be a Q&A session. So they're going to talk about their approach and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions about their process. So I think that will be helpful. All right. So over the last 45 minutes, you've heard a lot. We got to thank you, Demetria, Sandra, for sharing. You got a chance to look at just a couple examples right there. What most excites you about this fellowship? We want to know. So what most excites you?
Yes, and feel free to use that same hand raise function or the chat if you're more comfortable. We really would love to hear from you now about what excites you, what are you thinking about, what's your vision for how these intersect, and what will the world be like if we get more of this journalism? See, Renata has a great contribution in the chat. What if people believe there's a binary to a problem, but that isn't really the case? For example, Renata reports on mental health in Colorado, and the project would determine if everyone's agreeing, why does access continue to be a problem?
I love that. That's a great counterintuitive, right? Yeah. Like that's literally your subhead. It feels like, what's the problem? I mean, there are problems, but they're not what people think. So it becomes a mystery, like a quest story. And then would also be maybe interesting, if you're probably already thinking about this, but to look at a place where there has been progress on access to mental health services. And so as solutions journalism says, sometimes the best mystery is a howdunit instead of a whodunit. So that would be another way to kind of merge these ideas. And by the way, maybe we already made this clear, but just in case we didn't, why are we doing all this? Like, why does the world need solution stories that complicate the narrative? It's a lot of jargon, like mashed up together. And the reason why, at least for us, I think it's fair to say, is because in a time of really intense conflict, the things that are most missing are curiosity, agency, and hope. And you really can't make progress or thrive as a society without curiosity, agency, and hope. So our theory, and we could be wrong, is that if you could do solution stories informed by the research on conflict, you could get curiosity, more curiosity, agency, and hope, and therefore serve your community in a way that kind of more traditional journalism does not. So that's the theory. Feel free to disagree, discuss, but that's the case. That's the theory of change.
And we've got a few more things here in the chat too, Amanda. We've got Cynthia, building trust between people in one city who feel disconnected and disenfranchised, and learning a new technique within solutions journalism. That is exciting for Cynthia. That's awesome. Dimitri, I'm excited that SJ can be used to teach model critical thinking. Very cool. Absolutely. Ramona, priming more people to listen because they'll feel listened to and respected. I can definitely see a need for that in the world.
Yeah, that is one of the things that just comes up again and again, that half of what people want in conflict is to be heard. But it's like they won't let go of things until they feel heard. So it's like a game of chicken, who's going to listen first?
Liz says, much of my research focuses on gun violence and how media portray the perpetrators of such incidents. Complicating the narratives is so important to reduce racial bias, counter stereotypes, and inform people about the roots of gun violence in general.
Yeah, that's another one where breaking the binary techniques would work really well, right? So it's not like gangs versus non-gangs, and like police versus the people, and like these kind of, that's a great area as well. And one that unfortunately is going to probably be central for some time to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And Henry, thank you. I feel humbled to be here. What excites me is that solutions journalism keeps on growing and even expanding fellowship programs. Yes, amen to that. Yes, yes, yes. All right.
I'll just share. I'm so excited. Yeah, I'm just so excited by all of you here today. Already in this chat alone, I'm seeing so much potential in different issue areas: gun violence, education, mental health. One thing that you might often see in the news is surveys about how divided we are on certain issues. So we see those surveys, and we also have this awesome database some of you might know about called the Solution Story Tracker, where you can look up solution stories within those issue areas. So as you're thinking about this fellowship, as you're envisioning in these issue areas, I encourage you to look at the work that's been done and think about how you can merge these two, because that really is the great experiment and the great ask of all of you.
Fantastic. All right. So how about, what do you think, Jules? Should we go to some frequently asked questions so Amanda and I can kind of rip through those and others might pop up? Okay. Yes. So over the past couple of years, some questions emerged quite a bit. We hear repeats of, people are kind of trying to think through, how does all of this work? And one question we get is, is it necessary to do all of the CTN techniques in one story? And that can feel like a lot when you're just learning a new thing and you're learning about these skills and these strategies and you're trying to figure out, first of all, what's the story, and can feel really overwhelming. So the answer would be no. The first, I think Amanda would agree with this, we would say you definitely want to loop and ask those questions. Those different sorts of questions, revealing questions, those are really essential. They're like a recipe. They do work together to really get underneath what's happening, to get beneath the problem, we talked about really getting to the core of why people do what they do or believe the way that they believe, or experiences that they've had. Those two things are kind of like this magic recipe to help you in that process. So I would say, Amanda, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to become clear which work for you and the thing that you're covering and the conflict area, what's not being done in your area already. What is the narrative you're trying to complicate, right? Like, so So you'll it'll be like a breakfast buffet, and you will pick and choose the techniques that are right for you at that time with that particular story.
And another one, what about breaking news and complicating the narratives? Now, at the very beginning, I believed it was possible. I said, yes, we can do it. You can do it. And it is incredibly difficult to do breaking news and to incorporate these techniques. I will say, however, that getting beneath the problem and using those questions can be used in a breaking news situation. I have used them when covering protests. They do work. And so if there's one thing that you need to really lean on, and you've got a quick turnaround and not much time to think, those questions are really a valuable go-to. All right, Amanda, this one is all you. Looping feels a lot like I'm agreeing with my source. Is that true?
Yeah, I think there's an understandable initial reluctance to try to distill what the other person's saying and play it back to them and check if you got it right, because it sort of feels like you're agreeing with them. What we found is that people don't confuse those things. Like, they don't confuse listening with agreement. So, we would talk more about this in the fellowship because it's a really important question, and the devil's in the details, but that no longer slows me down, for what it's worth. I mean, I think it's different if you're doing a live, conversation with someone on air, right, Ellen? That's a different set of challenges, but in most cases, it's really not the same thing. And I think it's kind of how we got here, right? Is thinking that trying to understand each other means we agree. And that's a false binary.
That's right. And the next one, people are overwhelmed with information these days. Do they really want complexity? So, man, I think about the Difficult Conversations Lab. You might be thinking about something else, but what would you say?
Yeah, so Difficult Conversations Lab is this place at Columbia University where they pair up people who disagree profoundly on big subjects and analyze their conversations. And what they found is if you have people, before they go in, read a story that has multiple points of view, not just two, and acknowledges real complexity where it exists, people tend to have good conflict conversations, meaning they ask each other more questions. They do experience anger and frustration, which is fine. That's good, right? But they also cycle through flashes of curiosity and humor and understanding, and they leave the lab more satisfied. So while it is true that people are overwhelmed with information, they do miss the feeling of surprise and curiosity.
And this last one about confirmation bias and that fourth pillar, and just the difficulty of doing that when people simply just don't trust the news. Yeah, I know that, we talk about in interviews, kind of, and this is something with complicating the narratives. I remember talking with a lot of journalists about this, just, sometimes it's best, with the source, just to let them know, like, acknowledge like, this is me, this is who I am, this is how I'm coming into this. And I'm here for you. I'm here to listen and to learn, and to let them know that I acknowledge that I have biases, but it's not about me. And this is really about you, and kind of trying to set a tone for, or a space rather, for listening and learning, because we know that we have our biases, and then there are people that may think that we're coming in for a certain agenda or trying to do a certain thing, and just kind of to set the tone from the very beginning of the interview might be one way to kind of help get your source. This was specifically in regards to when sources might be struggling with confirmation bias through the interview, and feeling a certain kind of way about us as the journalist and what we bring to that interview. But is there anything else, Amanda, that you would want to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a stretch. I think it's ambitious, and I think it's part of a bigger package, right? Like, it's part of, like, looping is helping rebuild trust, and using visualizations is a sort of adaptation because of the lack of trust. So yeah, at the bottom of all of this, right, is a serious crisis of trust. So yeah, that seems right. There's a question there's a bunch of questions in the chat. There's one I could answer really fast if that's, does SJN and CTN work best for news that is read, or does it work on the fly for video or audio? I think it depends on the situation. I certainly use it on the fly in the podcast that I host. I use it all the time. One of the things about breaking news, to circle back to that point, is that it's actually not that surprising often, right? Breaking news, we can kind of predict what's going to be breaking. Not always, for sure, but we know certain things are gonna, like, we know when there's social protest, big protests, there might be smatterings of civil unrest, right? And we can prepare for that and know not to overstate it if it happens, and to put it in context so that it doesn't escalate. There's a lot of things we can prepare for. And again, that's where data visualizations, if you have them on the shelf, can be really helpful to help people under stress immediately put things in perspective, get a sense of the scale of the problem, whether it's a school shooting, right? That would be a good example of where things are really frightening. And when people are really frightened, they make bad decisions. So how do we put that in perspective for people while still being real? So I think there are ways to use it on the fly to answer that question. Sorry, that wasn't so short.
Excellent. Amanda, Ellen, thank you so much. I see we're at the hour, and I know some folks have already had to jump off for other calls, but I really, really appreciate you all joining us today. And I want to give a huge, enormous thank you to our speakers, Ellen and Amanda, one of whom happens to have a birthday today. And we won't embarrass by all singing to her, but Amanda,
Who leaked this information?
Me, it was me.
I have a theory. Yeah, okay, there it is.
And what a great gift for you both to be joining us today. If you have any more questions about the fellowship specifically, I'm going to drop my email in the chat. And I really just want to say thank you again. We welcome your questions, your creativity. The success of this fellowship really rests on you. And already from the chat today, I can see so many creative ideas brewing. We also want to welcome you to join us to next week's information session, where we're going to hear from 3 journalists who've applied this unique intersection in their reporting. So thank you so much again, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend and happy birthday.
Thanks.
Take care, guys. Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.